I've learned is that Trent Harris has redefined Utah cinema. It even went beyond the imagination I've had. Seeing some of the more than 850 feature films, TV movies, and TV series episodes made in Utah between 1913 and the end of 2011. Did you know that? More than 800? Close to 900. Well, this is why I'm here, and this is why Brad Westwood asked me to participate in this session, because as a Southern California transplant, this is the project that allowed me to get to know my adopted state, where I've been for 40 years. And this took about 30 years of it, off and on. But I committed a sin to my subject matter that motion picture companies would not do, but nevertheless I've done in the title of my address. Sources: Serendipity in Cinema, Researching Utah's Cinema Heritage and Finding a Neglected Component of Utah History. So what is the sin I committed? A title that would never fit on a movie market. But I did it, and when Brad asked me to do this presentation months ago, when you will consent to anything when it's a few months off, it was that title that came to mind. But to begin with, I would like to advance without hesitation that the history of Hollywood's increasing movie-making activities in Utah constitute legitimate Utah history, contrary to the overall neglect of these activities by historians for many, many years. Tourism, livestock, ranching, mining, politics, journalism, wilderness rights, and even water rights have occupied legitimately cherished positions in published histories of Utah. So, where has the motion picture industry been? Well, largely on the periphery. I couldn't find anything on it when I began this project. But maybe the movies themselves are to blame. Movies came and went. Even today, they come and they go, both as to their production in the state and when they arrive in Utah's movie theaters. Entertainment perhaps unfortunately earned a reputation of the transient, a cultural hobo, as it were, that hitched a ride in Utah's urban and rural movie theaters and left almost as soon as they arrived, only to be temporarily replaced by another one. That fleeting entry and exit perhaps is to blame for the sense of unimportance that has attached itself barnacle-like to the reputation of motion pictures and the business of making motion pictures in Utah. Make no mistake, I think Utahns, as are people nationwide, as captivated by these images in the dark as anybody else. But as history, movie making in Utah has only occasionally been noticed by newspapers. When 20th Century Fox or Warner Brothers or Paramount would come to a small southwestern Utah town to make a movie. 3 weeks, 4 weeks in the summer or fall, and they were gone. Perhaps this reluctance to even deal with the significance of Hollywood's coming to Utah reflects maybe an urban chauvinism, urban versus rural. After all, during the 1920s and 40s, a movie being made in the wilds of Kane County or Iron County in southwestern Utah were rarely covered by the Salt Lake Tribune, the Deseret News, or the Salt Lake Telegram. And without such attention, this news was, in effect, no news at all. However, it was in Utah newspapers that I began my research more than 3 decades ago, going page by page, frame by frame through microfilms before the Utah Digital Newspaper Project. And during the 1920s and 30s, those sources were primarily the Iron County Record and the Kane County Standard. Where they occasionally got the film name wrong or misspelled the cast members, their frequent detailed descriptions of filming locations and the local individuals involved with the movie companies, I found to be invaluable. But the tediousness of the task and the time involved lengthened the research time, as I noted, the passing years. First-person recollections with locals, years after the fact, in Kanab, Cedar City, Moab, and other locations, who were hired as studio extras, road builders, night watchmen, location meal caterers, doubles and stand-ins for Joel McRae, John Wayne, Maureen O'Hara, Henry Fonda, Richard Widmark, and scores of others, provided a liveliness to the narrative that wasn't quite there in newspaper accounts. However, I discovered that corroboration was essential when dealing with distant memories that were described with a vividness in the retelling that deceptively rang as truth. Sometimes an individual would swear on a stack of Kane County buffalo chips that they worked with this actor or that actress in a specific film. And they said, I was hired to work on McKenna's Gold, or The Greatest Story Ever Told, or Drums Along the Mohawk. But then later, checking dates, titles, and locations, I would learn that the interviewee was describing a bona fide activity. I mean, it did happen, but it dealt with a film other than the one that they remembered so well, or so the person thought at the time. On the other hand, I found some other of these individuals were the only link to lost film, and there are many so-called lost films in Utah's movie-making history. That is to say, films that were distributed theatrically, but for the ravages of age or neglect, no known copies exist. Unfortunately, one such film that fits in that category is the first Hollywood film made on a Utah location. In 1924, in the Cedar City area, and it was called The Deadwood Coach, starring the most famous actor of the 1920s, Tom Mix. Sadly, no copies of this film exist, and the handful of surviving photographs that document where this was filmed are in the book. I was nevertheless constantly in search of someone, anyone, still alive, who might remember Tom Mix and the filming locations for this lost film. Time was running out. But when I was in Washington County, someone told me about an old-timer, Rupert Roosh, who, with the exception of an LDS mission and military service, was a lifelong resident of Springdale, just outside Zion National Park, which from photographs I had indicated was one of the filming locations for the Deadwood Coach. They told me where he was, and I drove down the highway, knocked on his door, and there he was, this kind, bent-over, elderly gentleman who welcomed to talk about the old days. Yes, he remembered Tom Mix, and he showed me where the filming occurred on the Virgin River, just up from his house. And also, there was something else that happened. He recounted Tom Mix's trying to buy his prized horse, Roosh's prized horse. And at the time, in 1924, Roosh was just a youngster, but he wasn't sufficiently starstruck to make a deal with the famous Western actor. And Tom Mix had to go back to Hollywood without Rupert Roosh's horse. St. George resident J.L. Crawford grew up in the same Springdale, Rockville area as Roosh, and he took a picture of Tom Mix with the local boys in their bib overalls and with smiles that reflected the rarity of this grand occasion. Crawford remembered seeing the Deadwood Coach in Springdale in 1925. The local boys, including himself, Crawford told me, treated this as a great occasion by dressing up in their toy six guns and wearing their chaps when they saw it. But the projector showing the film had to be powered by a generator, gas-powered generator, brought along with the projector by an itinerant theater man by the name of Alma Flanagan. We didn't get electricity in Springdale for another 3 years, Crawford told me. Incidentally, that picture that Crawford took of Tom Mix and the smiling boys is in here. What I found particularly satisfying in these interviews were those times when I digressed from a film-centric interview with a Utah local in order to talk about area history and how they lived their lives at a particular time connected with the movie about which in my mind is what turned out to be a lengthy interview in 2008 with a 97-year-old Vilo DeMille in Rockville, just outside of Zion National Park. The county recorder told me about DeMille, a lifelong resident of the area, who had grown up in Grafton, now a ghost town across the Virgin River from Rockville. So, why was I looking for someone like DeMille? The first all-talking Western movie Hollywood ever made was made in Grafton and in Zion National Park, and it was called In Old Arizona, oddly enough. Made by the Fox Film Corporation. I was having an understandably difficult time finding anyone who was around in 1928 when In Old Arizona was filmed. Meeting the aged but enthusiastic DeMille turned out to reveal some very rich memories. She remembered filming of the movie there, and she was even hired as an extra on its sequel, The Arizona Kid, also made in Grafton in 1930 by the Fox Film Company, starring Warner Baxter, who reprised his role from In Old Arizona as the Cisco Kid. And Baxter also got his only Academy Award for his portrayal of the Cisco Kid. Also in The Arizona Kid was a young girl who was making a name for herself in movies. Anyone ever heard of Carol Lombard? Yeah, she was here on Utah soil. Vilo remembered the magnetism of the film's star, Warner Baxter, and the thrill of receiving each day's pay, $4, in cash, counting it on the floor of her Grafton home, and putting it under her bed to use later on when she went to college. The total amount, $48. Her description of growing up in Grafton during the early 1920s was fascinating as I steered the interview from the films into that direction. There was no electricity in Grafton during the 1920s to the 60 or so residents of this little town. Church and school was conducted in the still-standing adobe brick church built in 1888. And entertainment for Vilo and Grafton's other youth, sitting out on the front steps of the church, strumming on a guitar and singing. Shopping? She said, we did it once a week, sometimes once every 2 weeks. My father and mother would pile us into the wagon with their siblings, the horse-drawn wagon, for an all-day journey down the steep zigzag road down the Hurricane Cliff to Hurricane, closest place to do any shopping. I remind you, this 20-mile or so journey took all day in a wagon, and this wasn't in the 19th century, this was in the 20th century. Vilo's family stayed overnight in Hurricane, did their shopping, and repeated the all-day wagon trip back to Grafton. Life was slower then. Vilo earned money by picking fruit for a neighborhood woman for 10 cents a day. And when In Old Arizona came out, those in Grafton, Rockville, and Springdale had to see it at the Electric Theater, many, many miles away in St. George. I also mined considerable information from manuscript sources in many institutions, including the studio archives of Warner Brothers and 20th Century Fox. Their photo archives revealed images of behind-the-scenes production work on a number of films. In Old Arizona, Zane Grey's Western Union, and dozens of others. But those photographs contained something in it other than the big stars that most people cared about. It contained photographs of locals in Kanab, Moab, Grafton, Zion National Park, who I could instantly recognize and were of great value for the book. The Utah Department of Publicity and Industrial Development was created in 1941 to boost the state's profile and deal with economic issues of taxation with growing industry in the state of Utah. One of the great important manuscript collections that I came across was right there in the Rio Grande Depot. The archives of the Utah Department of Publicity and Industrial Development, which I'll simply reduce to the acronym of PID. In that collection, as I spent hours and hours, days and days poring through it, I found connective tissue that helped me pull together the history, the movie-making history of Utah. They assisted in the helping of building roads for the movie companies to filming locations not otherwise available on the established roads. To be sure, the Perry brothers in southwestern Utah and rancher George White in Moab facilitated movie companies coming to their areas to make movies. But involvement of the Utah PID was crucial in numerous logistical ways to making a studio's time in Utah a successful one and to ensure their return. They also took a great interest in publicizing the fact that John Wayne, Fred McMurray, Randolph Scott, Ava Gardner, Frank Sinatra, and a number of others spent weeks living with the residents of this state while making the movies. To conclude, yes, Utah's movie history is indeed legitimate Utah history. But I would also add that it is not only a history of commerce, but of social history as well. That is, how the coming of movie companies to the many remote southern Utah communities affected life there. And conversely, what was the effect on the movie companies and their crews and the stars by meeting those people in remote communities like Moab and Kanab. But I want to add that it's a history, the movie history of Utah is a history of something else, imagination. What do I mean? How about the American Revolution having been fought on Cedar Mountain near Cedar Breaks in 1939? I'm referring to John Ford's Drums Along the Mohawk, made there. Or about the origins of Christianity having occurred in Kane County, wherein John the Baptist, in the form of Charlton Heston, dunked the first Christians, and that Max von Sydow, as Christ, really delivered the Sermon on the Mount at the Grandview Overlook in Canyonlands, over by Moab. Or how about the 16th century Genghis Khan triumphing over his Tartar enemies in Snow Canyon near Ivans in 1955? That's the Howard Hughes blockbuster, The Conqueror, that played a central role in the real-life Downwinders saga, involving nuclear bomb testing, radioactivity, and many, many Utah cancer victims. Finally, can Utah and the Goblin Valley State Park really have been that alien planet to which Tim Allen, Sigourney Weaver, and Alan Rickman landed in 1999's Galaxy Quest? Or in Trent Harris's epics? If you've been exposed to these films or any others of the more than 800 feature films, TV movies, and TV series episodes made in Utah, you can't go very far, or maybe even return, to those same areas that were used in those films and think of them the same way ever again. And you won't think the same way about Kenai National Park when you come at 1:30 today to see Ramrod, Utah's centennial movie, starring Joel McRae and Veronica Lake. I promise you won't. It's a great film noir western. Well, because of the rich movie heritage in Utah, not only will you become acquainted with a unique slant on Utah's history, a much neglected aspect of Utah's history, but to quote a phrase that you will see around town, you will also experience